Hello, this is Philip Steiger at thebest3d.com, and I wanted to welcome you to another session on discovering the beautiful things you can do with PD particles. This is version 9, kind of derived from code from Project Waffle 9.7. So there are some differences and some new features in the interface that you did not see in 9.6 of other versions like PD Artist or PD Howler. PD Particles 9, we call it also simply Particle 9, is very much focused on painting, and there are some filters and a few effects, but for the large part and for the major part you'll see really focusing on painting. And in fact the number of shortcuts down here, you click these icons for different categories of brushes. So I have actually a brush loaded here which is not down here, except for a few. There are some nature brushes here, and there are some willow trees and others that you can grab from right there. And the weed painter and so on. But the fun part really is when you go straight into the particle brushes. So select the brush right up here. That's the default tool you have here. Along the toolbar you'll see a number of other tools and some very advanced curve tool and a number of selection tools to create your custom brushes as well, even animated brushes consisting of multiple images. But what we'll focus on today is just the brushes that are known collectively as particle brushes, right? Because there are settings here that affect most brushes. You can right click on the brush tool to see a number of them as well. And there are internal brushes or large custom image-based brushes, and then there are particle brushes. There's also a category called bristles, which is really a subcategory from the bristles. So when you click on particles here, you can pin this down to keep it along, and you'll see there are 4 categories. In the beginning there was one category called the particle brushes. So when you enable that, you'll see all sorts of interesting things, not just one brush stroke, not just one piece of pigment going along the path, not just one line being drawn, but a whole category of different styles. And you can see, for instance, the baddie grass allows you to create easily a field of grass and tufts of bad grass to some extent. Let's go see some other examples. Loading blue eyelashes, that's the one we had just here at the beginning. There are some brainy things, and there are some, let's see, the Genie Effect, spiky stuff. There's lots of other things, and there are also on the website, if you look around, you'll see some additionals that you can download, some presets that have been donated by other artists. And you can see wind-blown grass. So let's say you're creating some artwork and you have some scenery in the background, and now you just need some grass in the foreground. You can quickly put a couple of those here to good use. There's really a lot of things to try here with just these. Basically the particle brushes, as you can see here, there's a whole set of numbers that will, for instance, control the lifespan of the particles. And if you make them very short, instead of 20 units, if you give them 5, you'll see how these pine branches will be much shorter in appearance. Now that can be great if you want to actually make a pine tree, right? So you go something like this and then gradually build your way down to longer branches, and then you might want to increase the parameter here, lifespan, maybe 9, and go to a little bit thicker appearance, give it a little bit of variety, and quickly create your new type of brush. And that's an image that you can pick up as a brush as well. So if you, for instance, if you want to pick up this tree or just a portion of it, you might want to delete this part here. It's in the way. Let's go undo and uncheck or disable the brush for right now. Let's go and find ourselves a tool that we can use to erase, and one easy one is simply use an airbrush, like the large airbrush, and use the right button to erase to the same as the erase color, right? Paint on it with the erase color. We have those 2 colors here, black and white, and right now white is a secondary color, so it erases or it paints back to that. It's not actually erasing in the sense of making it invisible, but it's actually replacing it. with the same color that happens to be the background color. So it appears like, you know, just like in the real world when you paint with a color on top of a piece of paper that's actually the same color. You end up not seeing that paint you just placed there. But what I wanted to do is isolate this tree so I can now pick it up. There is a tool here. That's a custom brush selector tool, right? Or we call them also the custom brush pickup tool. And with that, you get to pick up a portion of the image, such as this. There you go. And it is now your brush. You can see it in the preview. It's not at full opacity yet. By default, it's about halfway. So we can click on this opacity here, right here, and make it full opacity. Now we have it there. And you can stamp it down and have multiple instances of that tree appearing all over as you paint with it. It's something you might want to also store the image of this brush, and actually more than the image, also some other parameters like the mode, its opacity, and so on. So there are some icons up here that are really good for your workflow. One here is to store the current image, store a copy of the image, and that will give you a quick snapshot of it that you can later retrieve again. So for instance, if you do any sort of changes to it and you say, no, that wasn't good, I want to go back to this stored copy, just click it and it will restore it right back there. But there's also a storing of the brush, and that's this icon here. There's something in between here. That's to store the current selection. We'll talk about that in another tutorial, but the brush is something we'd like to store right now, so let's click that here. And there you see it. There's your tree with transparent background, as indicated by this plaid pattern checkerboard, and then you'll see the tree in front. So the beauty of this is that you can make some changes to that too. It's not just storing it, but you can say, let's make it bigger. Now you see a much bigger instance here. Let's go and clear. There you go. So you could easily do a sort of a perspective scene by just reducing the size and have a couple of these, and then increasing the size a little bit to come back to about this big and this, and then perhaps have one more that's supersized and have something like this, and maybe one more there. Alright, so that's introducing you to the custom brush, because we've built this brush ourselves from an image, right? And this can be a very large image, even bigger than the canvas on which you paint. You can do other things with it too, other than resizing it. You can rotate it, give it different orientation. You can also change the hue, the saturation, give it more of a bluish look, a bit more of a reddish or greenish or purple, whatever. There's also saturation, so you can make it really highly saturated green, or you can make it almost none of it, like grayscale. That's really good if you want to add some perspective also. So get rid of some of that saturation if the tree is farther away in the scene, and then give it a little bit brightness or darkness as well, right? The hue saturation value. With the value, you can make it a little bit brighter, and to the eye, that will make it think that it's closer. And when it's darker, it seems like it's a bit farther away. It disappears in the scene. There's other things you can do with it. We'll do that in another tutorial. This is talking about frames that are multiple frames inside an animation. So you can have a film strip with multiple frames, multiple images, and animated brush, essentially. This one here is just one image, and that's all we expected from it. Whenever you use these self-made brushes and you want to get back to them, one thing you can do is you can minimize this right here, and you have a little icon. You can easily get back to that. So if you change the brush to a different brush, such as, let's say, one of the oily, like totally oil brush, and you smear it along, and then you want to get back to this, just click it and you're back to this particular brush. Now we want to go back to the particles, so let's see what else we can do in terms of particles. The particle brush we've played with so far was just one type of rules, one set of rules, right? We have how many particles are there, how many are being shot out or emitted, how many particles are there per emission, how much mass do they carry, how much gravity is pulling them down. It could be negative or positive, it could be pushing it up. All sorts of parameters here, and I encourage you to play with this and see if you can come up with some other great type of foliage or grass or tufts and bushes and all sorts of wacky stuff as well. As we've seen, there are some that are not really looking so much like real plants, but maybe more something like spinky and other funky stuff. There you go. All right, so now that's one set of rules, right? Here's the rules, one set of rules, and there are a lot of other styles that you can use. Shrinking lines that start very wide, and you control the initial width, initial size, but they get thinner as they go. There is the gain also, how bright they appear. And then there is tinting against the current color. So if you make the color kind of a reddish color, then you get more of a reddish tint. You have the shading also. If you don't do that, they don't get dark towards the bottom side. Here they are all the same. But if you enable the shading, then you get them to look dark when they start moving down, and that's really what you want. If you look at some of the shaded effects, like the grass, right, the batty grass, see how the bottom ones turn gray or dark, and that's the shading effect for you here. If you turn that off, it stays whatever it does. The gradient is what controls it. Here's the white color towards the end of the gradient, so it goes green. It goes white. And if the velocity, or if the gravity is not there, if you give it 0, it all goes in the same direction, up and down and left and right the same way. Let me erase this to a different color. Let's switch the two colors and erase to red. There you go. So you see here, without gravity, they just shoot out in all directions. But if you have, let's say you have negative gravity, negative 0.3, now you see it going up. Some of them still going down, and if you add the shading, they'll look like they're darkening. Now maybe you want to change that coloring. It's too much white there, so one thing you could do is click on that gradient and hello gradient tools. The sweep editor is one of them, my favorite of the gradient tools. And you can look at the red part, for instance, the green or the blue channel, and say there's too much blue, let's reduce that. Too much green also, so it gets a little bit more reddish now. Well, we don't quite use this one yet, do we? No, we actually do. So we are seeing a slight difference here in how much it's coloring, but maybe it's just too subtle because it's going to a reddish similar color to the end here. So let's give it a bit more blue perhaps, and you see how it's turning a bit more whitish again now in combination. Let's cut the green all together. Now we're talking. Now we're seeing a lot of that purple appearance there. Now you could also have the opacity change. So it's kind of transparent, opaque, transparent, opaque, transparent, opaque again and again. And that creates another set of illusions. And then you can also have the value, dark, bright, dark, bright, dark, bright. And pretty quickly you have a really interesting set of new flowers or other effects here. Now everything you do here was very much predictable and controllable, well, to some extent, because it is kind of a linear world and everything is shooting out according to initial speed, initial velocity we call it here, lifespan, number of times that they split and so on. But you could also disrupt all this by giving it a force field. Now what can act as a force field is this current image itself, or a new image that you create, such as some plasma noise or something else that you painted. I'm going to go and create a very quick one here. I'm going to go to disable the brushes, the particles that is, and then go to oils, totally oil, and just do something like, no, that's not this one, that's not what I wanted. Let's go with thick oil. Let's try that. There you go. Do a couple of these and a couple of verticals as well. Okay, so we have something like a pattern or sort of a shape combination. Let's go back to this and now say we'd like to use that as the force field. And what I mean with that is that these lines or these shapes will influence which way the particles actually fly. Right? Let's see before and then let's see after. Let's take the regular grass here, or the Genie Effect. Let's take the Genie Effect. The Genie Effect is very stubborn. It wants to go its own way and make a very strong impression. If we change the lifespan to a longer one, let's say 66, we see very long, spiky things, but that's what it does. And if we reduce the size, it's very thin, but still it's going its own way. Just like the legs of a, what is it, a daddy long legs, a spider, they just go and do their thing. And now what we'll do is we'll say, hold on, let's make this into a force field. So right here you see one more option, and there's a few more here too. But the force field here will take this image and turn it into a force field. And what I mean with that is that now if you increase the power, you'll see that the lines of the daddy long legs are a little bit under the influence of this force field. Right, so we have, for instance, something like this here. It's starting to line up against this. Right, so that's kind of the fun stuff you can do with that. And then sometimes you actually erase the original image, and it's still there. The force field is acting on it. So with that, imagine you take a portrait of yourself or your dog, or whatever your favorite pet is, and then you paint over it, and in no time you have something like a very artsy, very different appearance of this. The original image doesn't even have to be seen anymore. You can basically have it appear very different here. You might, for instance, change the size here to make it very thin, and at some point, or perhaps change the background color, erase it to black, and do another type of artwork with that. So let's keep that in mind, the force field here. You might want to ask Luke, can you paint under the, use the force? Can you paint under the influence of the force field? There is fog, there are some other things. Oh, more, that's the age decrement. And what that does essentially, it makes the twigs and the branches and so on of these grass helps get smaller and smaller the longer you paint. So now you can see that if you erase, initially it's fairly long and it gets smaller and smaller. Right? You can see fairly thick and long, and then they get just as they renew, especially if you give it some additional what is it here, the lifespan. You see the splits. Let's say you give it 22 splits. It can go for a long time, but as it keeps going, it's getting thinner and thinner. Let me turn the force field off so we get a better, clearer picture of that. See how it's doing everything, and now gradually it's going away. It's still going, but it's going very, very small. The lifespan is too long here. Let's give it just 9. And so now you see it. There you go. That's the age decrement. Right? Whenever they get renewed, whenever a new blast of particles shoots out, at first, normally it would go just the same way, the same size, the same length coming, and so on. But now it's actually age decrement. The longer it's been going, the smaller or the less length it will get. And so that makes it appear a bit more like what you'll see on trees and the branches as they go higher up to near the top of the tree. You'll see something that gets smaller and smaller, right? And so you could see things like these. All right, with the influence of the force field, even different yet again. All right, now we've seen a lot of different types of brushes just with this one, the particle brushes. That's one of 4. There are 4 categories of particle brushes. Let's take a look at bristles. These were introduced about 10 years ago. Yes, long before others came. These are bristle brushes. Okay, so there are a lot of things you can do with that. You can change the direction in which those bristles are acting. Just a lot of different fun things to try. For instance, you might want to take an existing image and then modify it to make it look like it was oil brushed or something like that. So let's say, for instance, we have a very simple image here, a little happy guy, happy dude, and then we'll take those bristle brushes and maybe you'll change how much wash they do. So you could, in fact, do the color bleed to the max, mix color to the minimum. So the only thing you see, you don't see new colors, you just see a lot of influencing changes. It's still under the influence of the force field, right? So all this disruptive, cataclysmic behavior here, that's also due to the force field. And so if you don't want that force field, bring it back down to 0, and then you have a bit more of a control of which way it's going. But you also can wait. Is that true? Is it really taking the force field? I don't know. But you know, you have a lot more you can do here. So there are also some presets to try, and some of them will give you the color of the brush itself as well. That's the color bleed. That's the mixed color part. and if you don't want it, you get rid of it. Alright, so next one here is the orbitals. Now orbitals, you want to think of a swarm of bees that are orbiting, I don't know, a pot of honey. Imagine you take your paintbrush and you dip it into honey, and now you have some honey on that end of the brush, and there's a bunch of flies or bees that are coming in and swarming around it. And what you do is you give them sort of a field in which they can swarm. So you see that here as you zoom in, you can see where they are. And then as you paint with it, they are leaving trails of pollen on the canvas. That's kind of the image you want to have of this. But they are somewhat erratic. Sometimes they fly around in weird circles or tubes, plates formation, all sorts of different effects you can have here. And then perhaps most importantly, they can also be in a slingshot or a spring mode. And with that, you create even more interesting effects, because it's, look at that, even just the preview you have here is showing a very interesting behavior for these swarms of bees. So let's say for instance, we use a color, not just white, but maybe kind of a bluish with a little bit of a teal look, something like this, and we paint that on black. And we want it to be brightening, so the mode we may need to set to additive. And so that's perhaps not the only place where we need to do that. There's a color bleed. Let's go without that. There you go. Mix color, perhaps add it together or mix it. So try a couple of different styles here, different sizes, and see if you can create some fancy stuff that you might want to blur or take further, or even use that as your force field, right? If you do something, let's say you do something like this, right? And then you go back to the particle brushes, enable those, and load your let's say your baddie grass, and use the force field, right? Enable this. So now you have, actually we need to probably close this. There you go. Okay. Here's the force field, and now you have the grass. Oh no, this one's not taking it because I did it twice. Once it turns it on, then it turns it off. There you go. This one is on, so you can go like this. And so now we have, see how it's now deflecting the grass. Here it's okay, it's doing its thing, and then suddenly, boom. Oh, it still has the age decrement. Let's go turn that off. More age decrement 0, so that it's not further disrupting what we're trying to achieve here. So undo, and now you see here painting. Oh, and suddenly under the influence, I know, got incoming email here. So now we have this under the influence of brushes, of force fields that was coming from the bristle brushes. All right, we've talked briefly about bristle brushes and orbitals, and now we have one more, which is the foliage brushes. And now this one is kind of an extension of the particles. When you see all these rules here, all this math, all these numbers, think of a few of them when you look at foliage brushes. All right, so when you enable foliage brushes, you do complete trees and bushes, and they have distinct number of different things. You will see branches, you'll see twigs, you'll see leaves, you'll see flowers, right? So they change the behavior, and that's basically saying that you don't have just one of these rule sets, one set of rules. You do have 9 or 10 of them, or up to that many, right? So you can actually see here rules library for a given type of foliage. You can see up to, I think it is 10, 10 different brushes, or 10 different sets of rules, right? So the first rule is that we have one twig coming out, a branch lifespan, how long does it live? Let's change that one. Let's change it to very short, and that should be a different appearance, right? So let's say we disable the shadows here temporarily. We'll talk about that in a second. So now we have this, and then we go and make it lifespan a little bit longer. Let's make it 33. Okay. Now these are not very different, because I think the initial branch is not what we're looking at. Maybe it's rule number 2. Okay. So branch lifespan, let's make that number 2. There you go. So that's a very short one now, right? So we end up seeing the next rule, the one that's bringing out the flowers or the leaves. But the lifespan here, if we change it back to, let's say, 8, we get some stocky, short little bushes. And then we could go to even shorter and say, let's give it a 5. There you go. Look at that. Now, let's talk about this other parameter that we had. Down here we had shadows. We have shading and we have shadows. Shading is the same as we had in the regular particle brushes. And what it does is it either, if you disable it, it doesn't do the shading. Or if you enable it, it will make those that go downwards appear a little bit darker, right? As if there is some shading and shadowing and so on. But there is another one here called the shadows. And that's a post-process. So when you do a first brush, you don't see it, but then a second later you see it. It's post-process. And it's actually looking at the 3D twigs. This is not a 2D brush. This is a 3D brush. It's painting these branches in 3 dimensions. Right? You can tell that, by the way, when you look at the rules library, it's got X, Y, and Z. Gravity pulling it in X, Y, and Z. So you can control a 3-dimensional vector for in which direction these branches go. And there are many presets here. So let's see, for instance, some cilantro, right? And let's go and paint this on bright white. There you go. All right, so what you see here are multiple rules in effect. And once a rule is exhausted, it goes to the next one. So you see initially that big stalk here, just one of them. Then it branches out to multiple rule number 2. And then rule number 3, and then rule number 4. So at the end of it, you'll see what to do. Split type. Is it splitting, or is it eventually reaching the end? So at the end of these, when you get to the leaves, probably around here, there you go, ends. Right? That's the end of it. If you wanted to, you could create your own cilantro or your own parsley or some other type of foliage and keep going and create up to 10 rules in this entire set. What's possible with that? Well, there's a lot of things you can do with it to paint all sorts of different trees and foliage. There are lots of evergreens here. Let me go and set this back to white background, or at least something lighter, something like this. Erase. There you go. So you see this type of tree here or foliage, this one is growing downwards. Probably has a high level of gravity pulling it down. So you could use this for something that's an overhanging tree or coming down from a balcony. Here we got some other classic trees. Right now, these are also under the influence of that shading, right? The shadows rather. So if you see that as you paint, it's following the mouse to some extent, the speed at which you go. There's a lot of parameters here that can influence the appearance. The maximum number of particles, the rule count, that's how many rules are in there, the maximum lifespan. Some of these you can override right there and also give it some additional ambient amount to make it brighter. Right? Give it a mix of different types of bushes there that are all growing together. And let's see what else. There's quite a number of presets here. Right? There are herbs. There are trees with snow on top. There are, let's see, ligustrum. Didn't even know that that's a word. But that's what makes it a little bit different here, because you can see that post work for the shading, adding some nice 3D depth to that. It is ambient occlusion. It is basically calculating how much light is hitting it from the outside surrounding environment, considering how many branches are there that are in the way and potentially making it darker because not so much light can reach it from the outside. So here's one where it's going to take a bunch of brush strokes before it darkens significantly, because these are not very dense trees. But you will see some others that are very different. And let's take a look at this one here. Okay, very light as well at first, right? But if you keep going here, and keep adding, it's like a whole set of flowers that you buy at the farmer's market. And as you get more and more of them, the inner parts, the inside parts will get dark. Right? Now you can also disable this shading or the shadows, and they'll be brightening it up a little bit because they won't be darkening due to the surrounding branches. They will still darken when you have this one here. The shading will darken as they go down, right? But the shadows is something that you can add for additional calculation here. to show a very dense load of weed, all sorts of different appearance and styles there. And what's really fun is to mix some of them. Right? You do want to get a couple of these together, because sometimes you do have a whole set of flowers and tropical things mixed together. And let's see a few more. There's some willow trees. I think we had one with snow on top. Let's see that one. Willow, 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 upshoot, tropical, vine, some stylish snow on the mountaintop. There you go. It's really snow on the treetop, but this one comes in handy if you want to show. Let's say you painted a landscape and there are mountains in the back with a lot of snow, or there are some hills in the foreground and some rolling hills, and there is some fresh snow on it. Well, one thing to do is to paint these trees on top and make it blend in with their whitish appearance, as if there was some snow on some of these leaves as well. Alright, well, I hope this gave you some great ideas of some of the vast choices in brushes, and we've only looked at the particle brushes here pretty much. Right? I mean, there are a few other types of brushes, but the particle brushes are fascinating enough that I thought they deserved their own tutorial, and so I wanted to show you those in a little bit more detail and make you realize that there is a 3D world you can explore here with this 2D paint program. That's PD Particles version 9, also known as Particle 9. It seems like it came from outer space, and that's what we'd like to thank you. Thank you very much indeed for your time and for painting with Project Dog Waffle. Have fun, and we'll talk to you soon again.